So Imperial qualifying just for the IEM Rio Major has obviously been an enormous storyline last week, especially for the Americas RMR. The whole story obviously ended up being centered around the last dance, even though it's not in any way a last dance. I mean, this team just doesn't even have a core that realistically played together in a last dance major winning type team, did it? It's also been all about Fallen and his dream, because everyone has to make everything about Fallen. Apparently what he actually did wasn't good enough. We have to fantasize about what he could have done and what he might have done and fictionalize it all and make it already. His real life is like based on a real story, even though we're watching his real life right now and it wasn't like how you say. But okay, I get that he's the big name and everyone's watching that. Or how about Cello, who was obviously overperforming and finally making a name for himself after years of mediocrity and being around and in the lesser teams, but not being a big time player. But it reminded me when I was watching this qualification campaign again about the infuriating but also irresistible career of Fur. This is the player I care about in this lineup. Even in this tournament, go back and look at the games and the maps they're winning. And he is the win condition, especially early on when the team was looking ropey as fuck and almost didn't make it to that last game and didn't have a chance to qualify until it came to the very end. This is someone you can see to this day is still feared by the lesser players, the younger players, the inexperienced players, because of the way his style works and when he cares and his game is on, how crazy his skill set is. There's still someone, quite frankly, I'll just say, I think he still has the skills. I think the aggression level is still there when he wants it to be. I think the aim can be as good as it ever was. And quite frankly, he could be on a much better team than Imperial right now. He is the overqualified one going down to their level to play on their team as a star. This guy could be a star on a much, much better team. A contender maybe for the major, a top 10 team in the world if it's the right squad. This is someone where if he's available, I'd tell people, if it wasn't for the things I know about his motivation, get him. Look what this guy can do. There's very few players in history are this good in that style of role. But here he is, helping Fallen barely creep over the line, qualified to tournaments that they're going to get bounced from long before they're ever going to be relevant in terms of who wins the title or who has a chance to. This guy is actually going to go down, aside from with Brazilians, as one of the most underrated players of all time. And quite frankly, I think Brazilians underrate him in the context of where he is in their pantheon and how much they overrate Fallen. But you know what? Some of it is his own fault. So let's get into that, shall we? First career is that if you go back to the beginning of Brazilians being even vaguely relevant, at least being part of majors and big events and having a chance to upset the big dogs in BO1s, it's 2015 when he was on Kaboom, which then became Keyed, which eventually became Luminosity Gaming. And quite frankly, when they were Kaboom and Keyed, so they didn't have Cold Zero back then, they did have Fallen, by the way, but he wasn't even an AWPer most of the time. This guy was far and away the best Brazilian player. He was actually a player on, like, in theory, a bad team, like a low top 10 team, more like higher, more like maybe like the 13th best team at most occasions. Probably even less than that if we'd had a proper ranking back then. It wasn't actually a ranking, it was just me doing my ranking, which was the top 10 only. I actually think he was much better even than some players in the top 10 teams. He was actually a player who had legit star power. You looked at his skill set. He was absolutely not only the best player on these teams, but quite frankly, if you go and look, even when Cold Zero initially joined Luminosity, which was not at the end of the year when they made the run at DreamHack Winter Stage 3 and then went on to be one of the best in the world, Cold Zero was there for months before that. They had the Cold Zero and 4 and Fur combo for months and months in a bunch of majors. They didn't do much with it, is the point. They just cracked the top 8 and that was it. Like, people actually overrate in general how some of those players played together until they got the other pieces and rounded the team out, until people like Zeus were having a bigger impact on them, and they got him obviously later at the end of that year. So I think when you go back and you look, this guy, he was even better than Cold Zero initially when Cold Zero came in the team. He was a big-time fragger, was putting up big numbers and big amount of kills, and was just the engine of that team. He's the reason they had chances to do these crazy things against the players from the other scenes. Like, you think of him, it's not quite as extreme, but he was sort of like a Nico in Mouse Sports. Like, that's the kind of, like, potential he had to turn a game around that you had no business winning. Yeah, sure, Fallen's calling was very good at the time. His AWP wasn't even a thing. It wasn't relevant early on. He was letting other people AWP. And then Cold Zero came in and added more fragging, started to develop into a star player, but even then he had the more passive style. This guy was the ultimate impact player on that team. Then comes 2016, and this is part of the problem for Fur, because this is when the team really elevates, and they're top 3 every event, they're in the semis all the time, they're winning tournaments, they're winning back-to-back majors, but it all becomes about coldzera, and coldzera is the guy the stats says, the best player in the world, best player in the team every match, seemingly, and then you have Fallen, who was having a big year, and was having breakout performances back on the AWP, and showing that unique style of AWPing, and get off big game performances and winning clutches. And at this point in time, Fur had to become more of a role player, because look at how he plays. Look at what's like the kind of entry spots he plays. Look at the way on CT side, some of the positions he had to play. He essentially was, it seemed to me, was willing to just sacrifice and be just a good rifler on this team. By the way, he still fragged really well, but the team wasn't based around him. He wasn't like the sole win condition. And quite frankly, what he would do to open the game up would then be cleaned up by coldzera. coldzera would get the stats, would get the crazy plus minus when he play the kind of roles and style thirders. You're not going to have the crazy plus minus. That's why I judge your config-esque on the raw killing numbers, on what I see you do with my eye test and the space creation. Some of your frags go on the other people's scoreboard as far as I'm concerned. So you look then, and it's understandable why coldzera dominated the story. The best player in the world's from Brazil, and then Fallen, he's back on the AWP, and he's a good IGL, and he's winning all these clutches, so he dominates the story. Even the whole FNX thing of, wow, FNX is back, and he's winning majors, no FNX, no major. Tacos went from like, why is he on this team? And it's like there was no space for Fur. He was the afterthought. Even my mate Zeus ended up being an afterthought. Wasn't appreciated till years later when he went elsewhere. People just assumed it was Fallen and coldzera doing it. How did they do without my mate Zeus? Weird how that works, isn't it? I have the eye. I know who's actually legit, boys. But then came 2017, and this is where y'all done fucked up, because this is when he truly became underrated, in my opinion. coldzera was still the best player in the team in the world for most of the year. Okay. Fallen wasn't as good this year. I'm telling you, go back and watch the tournaments. But you know what? They still won titles, so it was assumed he must be as good as an IGL and as a player, and he still won a bunch of clutches. That's the one thing about Fallen's game's never really gone away. You see it now at the RMR if he's playing bad enough teams. He can still get those clutches off, still do those decisive pushes, but it's not like he dominates a whole half, a whole game in the same way as he used to. In this year, he was already dropping off a bit, was already having some issues and wasn't quite as good, because he was never just the god AWPer. He had a very specific style that seemed based around how the team worked, quite frankly. But this guy, Fur, was a monster. A monster. If you ever want to go back and watch an underrated year, go back and watch how this guy performed this year. He could have won a whole bunch more MVPs. I think he won like 1 or something. He could have won a whole bunch of them, guys. The problem is he had coldzera with him, who has that super efficient style and whose game and stats are going to directly benefit the better that Fur does. You can't just kill the whole team when you're an entry player or a guy pushing on CT. It's not going to happen that often. It's the clean-up player who's going to get the monster numbers, isn't it? So in my opinion, you go back and look, his fragging numbers are bonkers. They're so out of this universe. He was regularly at big lands with tier 1 teams hitting 0.8 kills per round. This guy was fucking nuts when you consider how aggressive his style is, how he loves to play aggressively, seemingly into nothing when he's on T side and take every chance in the world. CT side, the constant aggression, the map pressure, the threat of a flank, the threat that he'll just come and take on your entry pack by himself and kill 2 of those motherfuckers and delay it and give to, oh mate, this guy was one of the craziest impact players you'll ever see. Everyone knows the stereotype of him playing overpass and pushing up on A all the time and being around like the bathrooms or the long or right into the playground and pushing behind you if not. And even some of the best players are coming and taking that initial spot you take against the AWPer and getting their head smashed off by Fur and having to account for him constantly. He's the reason, in my opinion, FaZe Clan had some kind of fear or mental block against this kid game. It wasn't Fallen calling. It wasn't coldzera being really good. Guess what? They've got Carrigan. They've got Nico on their side. It's that, you know what? They didn't have a Fur. They had Rain, who was very good, but he wasn't Fur, mate. So the problem is I always thought it was Fur that made it a nightmare because of what he did at Overpass. Carrigan and FaZe are a very good Overpass team. Carrigan's one of the great Overpass IGLs. The problem is everyone billed it as, because they looked at the raw record, Carrigan just can't beat Fallen on that map. It's like, no, this team, FaZe Clan, can't beat fucking Fur on that map. If you go back in 2017, talking kill to death ratio here, not HLTV rating, Fur averages a 1.25 kill to death ratio on LAN against Fur that year. That means he is averaging a +4 every map he plays against this team. And this guy was no sense playing passive, no sense playing conservative, no sense even trying to play for stats. He just played to take your fucking heart. That's what this guy was all about. It's so sick to watch. You saw how he did mental damage to some of these fucking people. Some of these people will never forget the games they played against this guy. He was probably, in my opinion, the most underrated second star ever to play CSGO. Because that year, he was a true 1B option. This wasn't like when people overhyped Electronic in 2018, but Simple was just the best tournament after tournament. And then Electronic would sometimes show up and do a good job, and even then often not be as good as Simple. No, this was like Get Right and Forest at the beginning of CSGO shit, where it's like we might even have the two best players in the server at most times. And even when our one guy's the best, the other guy's right there with him, mate, and they play such different styles. You can have the discussion, you can have the debate if you want. Now, in 2018, there was a drop-off for Fur. This is where the infuriating aspects of his career begin. Seemed like he had motivation issues as the team got worse and as MIBR brought in those foreign players. Seemed like he didn't really give a fuck. You heard rumours that even back when they were in 2017, maybe he didn't practice very much, didn't play as much as the others, didn't basically try to keep his aim and his skills up, but he was just still really good. That's because, let's be real, after all those years of battling and coming from seeming poverty and hard times and living together and 2 and 3 people in a bed, etc., now the gravy train had well and truly arrived. Now they were on the monster salaries month after month after month, whether they were good or not. Now they had the MIBR brand behind them, representing Brazil and all that, massive fan favourites. Now they're getting invited to every tournament, no matter how good they are, because you want the Brazilian viewership, because you want these big star players, because you want Fallen and coldzera to be at your tournament. And he had way more bad tournaments. He could still have a pop-off where he showed you, like, oh, he's still in there. That's still the same fucking guy in there. It reminds me how BJ Penn started to fall off. He'd still have a round in a fight. We'd be like, oh, the old BJ's in there, the old fucking, like, GOAT content. Oh, the fight's still there, but it's not quite there enough, though, is it? The motivation isn't there enough. He's not working hard enough. And 2019 was even worse. That's why when it was at that Star Series after the Katowice Major, I think it was around April, in China, when he did that tweet where he trolled and pretended he was retiring, I actually thought, I mean, to be fair, good. Like, he's making a bit of a fool of himself now. People aren't going to remember how great he was. Like, he had an amazing career. So, yeah, maybe this is the time. You pull the plug, you ride off into the sunset, you made a lot of money. You could probably still make some good money on the side doing whatever, being sort of some sort of a figure in Brazilian CS. Maybe that's the right move. Sadly, he was just trolling and he stuck around because I get the vibe with those MIBR guys. It's like Virtus Pro players at the end. If you're making the 20, the 30k a month and all the other stuff and getting invited to tournaments and have the odd prize money coming your way and you've got other business interests and sponsorships and deals, then you know what? In that scenario, you're not just going to think of your legacy and think yourself as a great sportsman, like, when's it enough and when should I cut? You're actually just going to go, you know what? You have to pry this enormous fucking amount of money I'm making out of my cold dead hands in this scenario, metaphorically. Like, I ain't going to give it up. Like, as long as they keep paying me, they keep asking me to turn up, I'm going to say yes, no matter what I look like and whether I give a fuck. And then you go to 2020 and on, and it was just whack, especially when there was no lands, because this is a definition of a land player. Like, remember, he was in Imperial before Fallen of those guys, and it was whack, and he was fucking whack sometimes, quite frankly. So I think this is a guy where he's one of those players, he's a rare breed, where it's about how much he cares and what his motivation is, and that is what will determine how good he is. There's lots of players out there who are trying their hardest and can't be that great. There's lots of players out there where they have to be motivated or they'd be out the team in 2 months. You'd never hear from them again. They don't have the insane talent and potential that someone like this has to allow them to stick around in times when you might not know they're not motivated and they still look good. If you look, when he had the fire early on, he was an irresistible force. When he was against top players and in big games, one of the best players of all time, right? In 2017, go look this up, against top 5 opponents on LAN, and they played plenty of maps, he is only 0.03 HLTV rating behind coldzera, the best player in the world, and the guy's getting all the MVPs, and a guy who plays a style that's way easier to farm stats from, even though also he was an exceptionally good player. This guy, I will say, wasn't as good at majors but then again, very few players are. It's one of the things that I think is very underrated. It's why I knew Simple was going to be the GOAT long before he was the GOAT. You just went and looked, he couldn't be stopped. Like, even when he had a bad final, you look at the rest of it, like, how did the numbers still go? Because he went harm elsewhere against everyone else, mate. Now, later, yeah, first game waned, as his motivation seemed to. In that sense, he's a little bit more FNX-like than a coldzera type figure. coldzera and Fallen, by the way, They all legit got bad and got way worse as well, but this guy seemed to let it happen. I don't think they did. I think they did battle. I think they did struggle. I think they did try many times to go to different teams and try things and change up their role and try calling, try not calling. Oh, they tried everything. This guy just seemed like he let it happen. And quite frankly, when I see some of the games he's had this year, I think he can reverse it. I think that's the worst thing. He's got that talent like a Shox, a Config, a Kenny S. He's got that crazy talent and ability where he can just turn it on, where he can let his game atrophy. That's why I'm using that analogy, atrophy through lack of interest, lack of use. But then he can start working and rehabbing that muscle. And then when he gets really motivated and he's really driven like a UFC fighter, does a really hard camp, he'll come and fucking body bag people. He'll come and be sick again. Like, this is a guy I genuinely think should have been, if he'd put in the work, in contention with Nico and coldzera and Get Right and Shox for that title of best rifle player of all time in CSGO. He could have been in that category. That's how special a player he was. I think the motivation angle even comes along with his style. Like, remember some of those stories we heard where when he was doing all these impossible CT pushes, there was a story that I think Fallen told where he said something like, oh, Fur actually doesn't want you to tell him like the anti-strat or like where they're going to be. He'd rather just not know and then go around the cuts like, mate, that in itself's a bit infuriating because I know what he means. He doesn't want to like have it in his head that he's going to be there definitely. He wants to just like play off it and maybe even the thrill of forcing the surprise moment and the chaos is what he likes. But all I'll say is if you could explain to him in a different way how heat maps work and how certain concepts work, I think he could have been even more insane. I think that could have unlocked like a level that would make him unbeatable. I think that would be a really interesting angle. There's also that side component where he supposedly had like hearing issues or something at that point in time. So maybe even pushing was to make up for the fact he couldn't play off as much and couldn't use information or calls, and he wanted to just go right in your face, make it a brawl in a fucking phone box and knock you the fuck out even if he has to take a few blows himself. Is that kind of a figure, right? Oh, I mean, I guess if you want a UFC analogy, you'd use like Glover Teixeira, wouldn't you? This is a guy also, I think another reason he hasn't accomplished some of the things he could have and won more majors and more titles and MVPs, etc. is because he seems to have been very loyal to Fallen, unlike coldzera, unlike some of the other people in that lineup. Although then again, I don't think Fallen's been, quite frankly, very loyal to some of the other players in that scenario. Maybe I'll explain that one day in the video. I already did years ago, but you all know I have to restate these things for the morons. Now, I think this guy also, if he'd have put it out there, and if he'd have shown he had the motivation and shown that he was willing to, I think it could have been a much better teams. I'd have loved this guy to have been in a FaZe clan or a G2 lineup. Any of these rich Team Liquid, these sorts of really strong, like other teams that needed his style of player to unlock them and go to the absolute top. On his game, he is one of the very best to ever play. And you know I don't say that lightly. Everyone else, when they say very best, they mean like bloody 50 players or like, he's really good. Like when I talk about very best, I'm talking about on his game, he's like one of the 10 best players to ever play the game. That's how unbelievable his impact was. His aim, look, it's not like super sick, like everything's a first bullet headshot, but it was really good. It was really consistently good. He's the one actually where he just bursts and sprays and just keeps getting the headshots out of nowhere and flick headshots as he's spraying. And you're like, why does he do this? His style wasn't the one-tap Nico style, but it's fucking good. Like this is another guy, one of the best M4A4 and AK players ever to play CSGO. Incredible showman because of that entertaining style of play. The definition of a huge impact player. That meter on HLT, he's one of those guys who just breaks that shit when he's on his game. Makes it look like, so is he just like the MVP every time? Yeah, when he's on his fucking game, he is. This is one of those guys who I love to say that old South Park meme, and he's a fucking wheelbarrow for his balls. He just doesn't give a fuck. This guy's a monster. Put this guy, by the way, alternate history. Put him instead, when coldzera comes to Luminosity, take him and put him over on the old Immortals team, where there's all those like high-intensity style play, maybe more of a Samba CS style, like in your face, like mixture of people, hybrid AWPing and rushing, lots of more simple tactics. He would have fucking destroyed tournaments. He would have been the best player. He would have contended with coldzera for like best player in the world, the best Brazilian player, and would have been hailed as a much greater player himself, in my opinion. As they say in Portuguese, o Fur é monstro. He's a fucking beast, mate. But he's also one of the most infuriating players to follow in the history of CSGO. This video was kindly supported by Ahmed Hadjou, Hades GOUD, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Adam Ochs, Animosity, Bot Pounder 420, Jensen Goh, Kovacevicd, Pacy, Tobias Bernasconi, Tosh, Toucan, and as always, a special thanks goes out to my main man, Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Would you like to ask a question in one of those monthly AMAs where sometimes I roast people? Do you want teasers to find out who the guests are for upcoming shows and interviews I'm doing? Maybe you want to be part of one of those cool, lengthy esports discussions that I have. Well, if any of those perks sound tantalizing to you, put your money where your mouth is and join the Skrilluminati today, where? Via the Patreon link in the description box below.